All right, people. Good to see you again. Remember, quiz number 3 is due tomorrow, right? Okay. So if you haven't done it, please try to get it done. Be good to do. I think that's all I have to announce. Native American Heritage Month. I'm going to start with this woman. I'm going to start right with a saint. I'll jump right into it because I told you I want to do people who are on their way to sainthood, who can be considered Americans and were Catholic. And I'll start out right with a saint. She's not even on her way. She's been canonized. Finally, after many, many years, she was stuck at blessed. Saint Kateri Tekakwitha. Want to go back? Is there any back button? I don't see any back button. Let's see. Anybody go down there? Go up here. There I am. All right. Starting to figure it out. Okay. Now turn that on. Saint Kateri, Catherine. It's the Kateri. It's the Mohawk word for Kateri for the name Kateri for the name Catherine. So Saint Catherine Tekakwitha or Kateri Tekakwitha. She lived from around 1656 until 1680, 1656 until 80. So obviously there was no United States yet, but eventually, where she died became the state of New York. Eventually became the state of New York, the colony of New York. Yes, the colony of New York, and then separated from England, so it became the state of New York, part of the United States. So, okay, that's fine. According to my standard, it's good enough. It wasn't at the time. It was I think it could have been a British or a French colony. I'm not sure. It was right on the border. The French were actually up in where Canada, most of Canada was French territory. So I assume it's British. But anyways, New York, modern day New York is where she was from. Her name, Tekakwitha, means she who bumps into things. She who bumps into things. So I guess she was a clumsy woman. She was an Algonquin Mohawk, a Mohawk Indian, which my niece is a Mohawk Indian. She's of the Mohawk Nation. And she was the daughter of a chief in the community. So I guess, her father was kind of powerful. So, she had some standing in the community. And she was a convert to Christianity. She wasn't, they weren't Christians to begin with. She encountered missionaries, I think the Jesuits. But anyway, she encountered Christian missionaries and heard the gospel and decided that she wanted to become a Christian. The reason that she's called she who bumps into things is because there was a smallpox. There she is. There was a smallpox infestation or what do you call it? Epidemic in the area, and she got smallpox all over her face. And anyone who knows about smallpox, it's like a skin. It comes out on the skin and stuff like that, and it destroyed her skin on her face. So she had all these, I guess, a pockmarked face, and maybe it may have also affected her sight. So I guess that's why they call her she who Tekakwitha, she who bumps into things. Maybe she couldn't see so well because of the smallpox. But when she was 19, she decided to become a Christian, and she did. And interestingly enough, she took a vow of virginity. She vowed to never get married, to simply live as a Christian virgin woman for the rest of her life, which was countercultural. That's not what you were supposed to do. As a woman, you're supposed to marry and have children to perpetuate the tribe. You see this in a lot of cultures. Virginity was not something that was really prized. It was only prized in the sense that, the woman that you give in marriage should be a virgin. Otherwise, she was considered damaged goods, and you couldn't get a good bride price for her. No one would want her. So, you wanted to make sure that, but other than that, living, virginity as a calling, singleness, living a single life, an unmarried life as a calling, it's kind of weird. It's unusual in human history. You don't find that a lot, but you do find it. Nevertheless, I don't think her parents were very happy with that. They wanted, her to have kids, get married and have a kids. And she was unusual because she was a Christian, and most of the Mohawk Indians were not. So they thought she was a witch. She was accused of being a witch. And so it got a little bit dicey in her community. So she went to live, it was with the Jesuits. The Jesuits had a mission nearby. The mission system, yes, it gets a very bad reputation nowadays. But there was, and I'm not justifying any of the injustices that might have been done there, or that were done there, I should say, were done there. But there was also another reason, which was for protection, to protect the missionaries, but also to protect the converts. Because for some reason, when you're different, people want to kill you or do bad things. Anyways, so she lived in the Jesuit mission, and she slept on a bed of thorns, praying for the conversion of her relatives to Christianity. Ooh, tough woman. Anyways, and she died, apparently a holy woman, known for her holiness. This picture, Father Claude Chauchetière, painted by him around 1696. So within 16 years, apparently he knew her. So, I'm assuming it's somewhat of an accurate portrait of what she did look like. Okay, not exactly what she looked like, but it's close. Someone who apparently knew her anyway and tried to represent her as best he could. Anywho, when she died, apparently, all the pock marks and the damage to her skin from smallpox apparently disappeared. Wasn't there anymore after her death, which was a sign to some people that she was a saint of God. Anyways, 1885, took until 1885 for them to even open her process. And she went through the process. And it was only in 2012, so 13 years ago, that she was canonized by Pope Benedict XVI. And she was the first Native American woman of North America to become a saint. Can't say South America because they have Native American saints. They already had, Native American saints, St. Rose of Lima, St. Martin de Porres from Peru and stuff like that. But for North America, she was the first North America, I believe, not just woman, female, but the first North American, Native American saint to be declared, Saint Kateri Tekakwitha. Apparently, her last words as she was dying was, "Jesus, Mary, I love you." Beautiful, beautiful woman. And I asked Saint Kateri to please pray for us in this country, which she never knew would exist, obviously, but does now exist. And pray for her people, the Mohawk people, and all the Native Americans who are still with us in this country, especially those who are also Christian and Catholic. They may be confirmed in their faith and be blessed by God. Amen. Okay, where are we here? Let's see. Okay, back to the church. The church. Yes. Hello, church. Any Christians here? Hello, church. That was the thing in the 90s. They used to call each other, "Hello, church. We are the church. We are church." You want to say we are the church. We are church. To remind people that the church is people. It's not a building. It's the church is present when people come together. It's not brick and mortar. All right, fine. But that language sounds really dated to me now. It's like saying, Jesus is groovy or something like that. Yeah. Sounds dated language. But anyways, that's what we used to do when that's what I was subjected to when I was your age. Now I'm subjecting you to my inclinations, who were the apostles. Okay. So please remember, I went over the names of the apostles, or at least I read them to you, but there are other lists of the apostles. And I read to you Mark's list. But if you read like Matthew's list and Luke's list, or Luke's lists, I should say, right, Mr. Rosley? Luke's lists, right? Where's it going? Is this all? It's all wet. Is this from the spray, maybe? Someone went to town with the spray, all right? Anyways, you will notice that some of the names are different for the apostles, not these dudes. But if we look on the other slide, I give you other names. Like Bartholomew, well, there's another dude who's named Nathaniel in the Gospel of John. Matthew seems to also be called Levi. There's some guy called Thaddeus. Mark mentions Thaddeus, but in the other Gospels, there's a Judas, the son of James. Okay? So, I mean, what are we to make of that? Well, people forgot. They tried to remember the names. They remember the major people. Certainly no one misremembered Peter, James, and John. They were pretty important. No one forgot Judas Iscariot. Okay? But some of the others, they might have had two names, and so they're just using two names, but we don't know. Okay? Thaddeus is just to focus on Thaddeus. He could have had two names because he's called Thaddeus in Mark's gospel, Judas in the other lists, Judas the son of James. But there is a Judas mentioned in the Gospel of John, and during the Last Supper, Jesus is having a conversation with his apostles, and one of the apostles, Judas, not the Iscariot, asks Jesus a question. Okay, so John knows that there is another apostle. He doesn't give a list, remember, but he mentions a Judas who's not the Iscariot. So apparently there were two Jews or two Judases who were part of the apostles. So that kind of bolsters the idea that Judas may have been his real name, but he also had another name, Thaddeus, that Mark calls it. Possible. I don't know. Okay. Yes. I think it's one of those things where people like to remember there were apostles. They remembered the important ones. Maybe sometimes they weren't sure. We think there was someone named this, but that wasn't the point. They weren't. It was, again, Jesus. The point was telling the story of Jesus. This is an early picture of the apostles from 300, the apostles with Jesus, 300s AD, from a catacomb, an underground cemetery or graveyard, a Christian one. So they painted pictures of Jesus and stuff like that. And this is the niche in the rock where you would place the body or the bones of the person. And then someone painted a picture of Jesus. Well, I'm assuming. Doesn't look like, what you assume, right? Looks like a young man, no beard, dressed in kind of a toga type thing, like a teacher or philosopher type, I guess. And the same thing with the apostles. They're dressed in the same way. Okay? Does anyone notice a problem with this picture? And when Jesus is seated in a chair of authority in the middle. Does anyone notice a problem with this picture, though? Anyone notice a problem? Is there an issue with the picture, Ms. Jones? Mr. Tedeschi? Huh? Where's part of it missing? Where? Here? Well, no, that's not missing. That's supposed to be there. Why? What's it for? Miss Burris, what's it for? What's this niche in the stone, in the rock, in the wall? What's it for? What it was used for? In a catacomb. I got you. Burris?
There's a tomb.
It's the tomb where they place the dead body, the bones. No, I'm fine. I'm just curious what it is. What it is. Cheese. So no, that's not it. That's a good guess, Miss Jones. I appreciate that. But no. Look, I'm talking about the picture. About the picture, Mr. Boo. Something wrong with the picture. Yes, Miss Lacey. So why is that a problem? Trouble what? Yeah, they're the 12 apostles, right? But you only count 9. All right? Let's check. Let's do a head count. All right, got 1. There's a head here. Is there a head? There might be a little face there. I didn't notice that before. Is that? Could be, but it couldn't. Anyways, let's stick for what looks actually like a head. 1, 2, 3, 4, okay, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, 10. Okay, well, that's close enough. It's not 12. The 9 apostles, the 10 apostles. There might be an 11. If I'm kind of, I don't know. It's too sketchy. But certainly 10 apostles. Are there 10 apostles, Ms. Wanamaker? No, there are not. So what's going on here? It's a and yell. It's a conspiracy, Miss Via. It's a conspiracy. The Catholic Church is whitewashing history. They don't want you to see these things. Why they kept all the burials underground. See, there's really only the 10 apostles, not the 12. No, I mean, I'm imagining that the artist just ran out of room and didn't plan his picture. That's what I'm assuming. You know, he or she or whoever was painting the image on, started out and I was like, uh-oh. Yeah. I'm assuming. I don't think there's any big conspiracy going on. Okay, the church, well, we talked about that already. I gave you the definition for that. But my purpose is, what does the word mean? I don't think I've talked about what the word means. Ecclesia is the word in the Greek, in the New Testament that's usually just translated, or should say almost always translated as church. That's not where we got the word church in English. We got it through German, which came from another kind of Greek term, which I'm not going to go into. But if you look in a book, they'll say ecclesia, okay? Even though it's the same idea, even though the etymology, the linguistic history of the word church in English is not the same as ecclesia in Greek. Ecclesia simply means an assembly, people who are called together. In Latin, we might say a convocation. Yes, you have this at university, right? Convocation. Con from cum, with, but also has the sense of together in Latin. And voco, vocare, vocavi, vocatus, to call together. Convoco, convocation. Or an assembly, okay? And that's exactly what the Greek word means. Kaleo, to call, ek, out of. You're called out of, you're called together, okay? That's all it means. The word is not used, the word in the Gospels, the word is not used by Jesus very often, okay? I think I have to do this, but... It's not used by Jesus. In the letters of Paul and the other parts of the New Testament, it's all over the place. So, it's not an unusual word per se. But for Jesus, it is. He doesn't use this word ecclesia except for 3 places. He uses it in Matthew 16:18 and twice in Matthew 18:17. Okay, I want to be specific about that because sometimes, even in scholarly books, they'll say Jesus only used the word twice, and that's not totally true. The word is in 2 verses, yes, but actually 3 times, and only in the Gospel of Matthew does Jesus mention a church, an ecclesia, an ecclesia. But the word ecclesia was not unknown to the Jews or the early Christians because our old friend, the Septuagint, okay, when uh, those rabbis were translating the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, yes, remember the story of the Septuagint legend, okay? Whoever translated, I mean, the Septuagint is real, but whoever translated it, whenever they came across this word kahal in Hebrew, which often means an assembly, they used the Greek equivalent, which was ecclesia. Ecclesia means basically the same thing as kahal, okay? So Israel is described as an ecclesia, a church, if you want to translate it that way. The church of Israel, the kahal Yisrael, okay, especially when Israel is grouped in the desert receiving the law of God through Moses. Okay, that's especially where they're represented as a kahal, a great assembly receiving the law. But as I said, the word is used frequently in Paul's writings. And remember, Paul predates the Gospels. Okay, so it was there. Was it, you might ask, in Matthew's Gospel, does Matthew insert it into the mouth of Jesus? Maybe. He might have used the word ecclesia. Maybe Jesus used something else. Maybe he did use kahal or the Aramaic equivalent. And he does talk about his community of disciples quite a bit, but he doesn't seem to really give a name or a word to it, okay? As apparently I think the group would give a name to itself as the church, which we know was not the original way that Christians described their group, okay? Which maybe I'll get to in a second. Well, maybe I don't. Well, I can't see it here, so I'll mention it now. The ancient title, or the earliest way that Christians described themselves, was not even Christian. They didn't call themselves Christians. And apparently, the scripture verse in Acts of the Apostles is a tiny bit vague, but in Acts of the Apostles, it actually says that the word Christianoi, the Christians, or the followers of the Christ, was actually given to Christians by outsiders. That's how they described them to differentiate them from the Jews who did not follow Jesus as the Messiah. So Christian wasn't even a Christian term, really. It was given by outsiders. Christians, from what we can tell, called what their movement was, the way of the Lord Jesus. And we see this throughout, especially Luke's writings and Acts of the Apostles. He uses that older terminology. He also uses the word church, but there are a number of places where he talks about, they were preaching the way or teaching the way to somebody, or those who belong to the way, all right? Which is also a Jewish term, because that's how Jews described the Torah, the law of God given to Moses. It was the way of life. And we see that in the Old Testament. You're following the way of the Lord, okay? But the author doesn't mean necessarily a pathway. The pathway is the scroll of the law. The Torah is the way. Okay, so Jews also kind of describe their own religion in that sense as well. And Christians, of course, were Jews, and they took that over. But this is the way of Jesus now. He's their new law, right? So the word is used frequently by Paul and other Christian authors, even before the Gospels, and like apostle, it can have a broad sense and a limited sense. Okay? In the broad sense, ecclesia or church can mean all Christians, all those who have accepted Jesus, believe in Jesus, and been baptized. Okay? But it also can be, limited to an area, Christians in a certain town or region. So, for example, the earliest writing we have in the New Testament, 1 Thessalonians, opens with Paul greeting the church of the Thessalonians. Okay? Well, the church means the people. I mean, he's not greeting a building. He's sending greetings to the people. And he doesn't say to all of you who are in Thessalonica who believe in Christ. He says the church of the Thessalonians, or the churches of Galatia when he's writing his letter to the Galatians. There is at least one instance where could be a building, could already be referring to an actual space. Possible. It probably wouldn't have developed that early just because Christians didn't have any buildings per se, you know? They were still a persecuted group for a number of centuries, so they couldn't own property, so they weren't really building or able to build churches. They were just meeting in people's houses and stuff like that, trying not to get caught by the authorities. It was only later, like around the 300s, when toleration was granted that the Christians actually could, well, they did have some property, but they could recoup property that was taken from them, but they weren't technically allowed to own property for their churches. Nevertheless, in the first letter to the Corinthians, Paul writes about what kind of people should and should not be allowed to speak in church, an ecclesia. Okay? And here he doesn't seem to be meaning it in the broad sense of all Christian believers. He doesn't seem to mean it in the limited sense of a particular group of Christian believers, like living in a certain town or city. He seems to mean the group, the building, you know, in the church, an ecclesia. These are the people who should have authority to speak, and the others should be quiet and listen, right? Okay, well, whatever. Anyways. What did the early church look like? Well, let's look at Acts of the Apostles, Luke's portrait of the early church. We'll look at Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2. Maybe. Got it. Acts chapter 2, beginning with verse 42. Acts of the Apostles. I got you. Got you. Got you. See who else we got. What was the chest? You open it up? Okay. Have it yet? How we doing? Yes, we got it. Verse 42. Is.
They devoted themselves to the apostles, teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to everyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were believed.
Excellent. Thank you. Acts chapter 2. They held everything in common. Sell their possessions and bring all their stuff. Ooh, is that yogurt? What is it? Oh, tuna salad. That's tasty. Doesn't that sound like communism? Sure. It sounds like something weird. Selling all your, what if, your priest or your minister said, I want you to sell all your property and have a whole church? Give it all to the church? How would that go? Well, son. Okay. All righty. Flying solo, Miss Franco Zamora. You know it. There we go. Okay, well, let's break this down. In this short description that Luke gives us, this is our earliest description of life in the early church. He tells us that the early Christians were devoted to four things. Number one, the apostles' teaching, didache in Greek, teaching. The community life, okay, living together, worshiping together. I mean, I don't know that I shouldn't say living together. I don't make it sound like it's a hippie commune. But, worshiping together, sharing their lives together as Christians. Koinonia, unity, communion. This thing called the breaking of the bread, which is in English, it's kind of a saying we have for eating, having a meal with somebody. But this was more than just any meal. This is the reference to the Eucharist, to the Lord's Supper. The original terminology was to call it the breaking of the bread. And then the prayers. He identifies prayers. They committed themselves to saying their prayers in the temple. Okay. The translation, what does your translation say again, Mr. Tedeschi? They devoted themselves. Verse 42, what did it say again? Oh, okay. Just stop there. Thank you. Okay, it's the same as the NABRE. I just wanted to make sure. That's accurate enough, but it's really not close to what the Greek says. It doesn't give the force of the Greek. The Greek is proskartaruntes. I don't think it's on the PowerPoint there. I'll just write it here. Proskartaruntes. It says they were devoted. And, okay, devoted is fine as far as it goes. What does it say? Kartaruntes. But really what it means, the Greek means, is they were unwavering towards. So, if you wanted to maybe translate it a little more accurately, you might add the adverb intensely. They were intensely devoted to these things, because proskartaruntes has that intense meaning. They were unwavering. They didn't go to the right or the left. They followed the straight path of what? The teaching of the apostles, communal life, worship, and prayer. First, we start with the apostles' teaching. They were unwavering towards the teaching of the apostles. Interesting, because it doesn't say they were unwavering toward. Don't you think, Ms. Lacey, like you'd say unwavering towards the teachings of Jesus? Isn't he the important one? Isn't he numero uno? Why do you think Luke doesn't say they were devoted to Jesus? Okay. All right, yeah. I accept that, yeah. It's a good answer. But they're not Jesus, right? No. I mean, they're great, guess they were nice guys. Apparently, I'm hoping. But they're not the source, right? Right? I mean, wouldn't you want the source? Say we're devoted to, I follow the apostles. Oh, okay. Well, who do the apostles follow? Who are the apostles follow? Who's their master? What do you think, Mr. Closa? Who is the apostles' master? Who chose them? Who gave them authority? Huh? Ms. Dumas, did you say it? Jesus! Jesus! Okay, so I guess you could say Jesus is implied. It's implicit. But notice that we already very quickly have mediators. People being inserted between a Christian's relationship with Jesus. It's not so direct, is it? They go to the apostles for the teaching about Jesus. Jesus worked signs and wonders, but oh, looky here. They were astonished that the apostles were working many miracles and signs. Many. Oh, that's interesting. Just like Jesus. So I think Luke is trying to show there's like a faithful continuity between the teaching of Jesus that comes to us through these men, these apostles. Actually, at this time, only 11 apostles, right? Well, no, I'm sorry, they had to, they had to elect another one, right? In chapter 1, they had to clean up that mess. Yes, I'm sorry. So they're back to 12. So the 12 apostles. So I would say, just like you cannot underestimate, well, a lot of things you can't underestimate with Christianity. You can't underestimate Jesus. You can't underestimate the resurrection, the rising from the dead, and the change that made for people. But you also should not underestimate the importance of these 12 men called apostles for the early church, because they were in a unique position amongst all of Christ's followers. Good after that? Oh, good. And they were, oh, well, I'll get on to that. I'll get on to that yet. And they were made so by Jesus himself. Just to give you one example, if you look at the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22, okay, this is part 1 of Luke's big gospel, which includes the gospel and Acts of the Apostles, right? Okay, so we have a same author, apparently, continuity of thought. So this is interesting that he records this from Jesus. It gives us an idea of how Luke viewed the apostles and their importance for the Christian community. So Luke 22, verse 28. You with me? You with me? We got this all memorized, Ms. Abraham Bellamere, yeah? I wish I had the memory of a Baptist preacher, but I don't. Anyone not with me? Everyone with Mr. Palumbo? You got it? You're there almost? Mr. Cummings? Hopefully? Hinkle? Yes? Peralty? Luke chapter 22, beginning with verse 24. Who wanted to read before? I got you, Mr. Tedeschi. Who else wanted? Ms. Lacey, you wanted to read. Do you want to read this? Luke 22, beginning with verse 24, please? Yeah, thanks. All right. That's okay. It's all right. I'm trying to give you a hard time. Let's go, Ms. Franco Zamora. It's shaken. Go ahead.
Shall not God praise and the servant. It's greater at tea one who serves. Is it not one seated at tea? I am among you as the one who serves. Your dining child, I prefer it in the morning. This my father has come for one morning. Guide me and drink at my table. Sit on thrones judging 12 tribes.
Excellent. Thank you. You look in the footnotes for the cross references. And yeah, Mark chapter 9. Part of this seems from Mark, if I remember correctly. Possibly copied from Mark. But there. Yeah, or at least based on Mark. This is kind of different from how Mark describes it. But you have a similar scene where the disciples are arguing about who's the greatest of them. Okay. So it might be related to Mark, but then again, Luke might be getting a similar story. But then the ending of it seems to be a cue saying that Mark has in common with Matthew that he attaches to this story about Jesus. Okay. He also places it in a different place. He places this story at the Last Supper that occurs during the Last Supper. Whereas Mark places it differently in the ministry of after he reads Mark's gospel, Jesus makes one of the predictions of his death, say, you think I'm going to be a triumphant king and all this other, no, I'm going to be killed. I'm going to be arrested and killed. But don't worry, I'll come back. I'll rise again. It's fine. And at that very moment, they start having an argument about, hey, which of us do you think Jesus likes most? Which of us do you think, has done the most for Jesus? Which of us is the best of the apostles? Kind of like, in Luke's account, he places at the Last Supper just after Jesus has told them that one of you is going to betray me. In other words, he's saying, look, this is my last meal with you guys. We're not going to have any more because one of you, my chosen, is going to turn me over to my enemies. One of you eating with me now. And at that moment, the argument breaks out. Then an argument broke out. Who is the greatest? Well, it wouldn't be me, Jesus, because I'm Peter, right? And I'm the rock, and I come first in all the lizard. Well, it wouldn't be me, Jesus. I'm Matthew, and I'm going to write your gospel later. It wouldn't be me. Well, it wouldn't be me, Jesus, even though I'm named Judas, because I'm also named Thaddeus. So, I could go either way. Yeah? But I won't betray you. Great bunch of guys, you think? Great bunch of guys. No, you don't think so? Well, that's true. That's true. Like one of my good friends came up to me and said, Matthew just found out I have cancer at stage 4. Yeah, there's nothing they can do. Well, I'm your best friend, aren't I, John? You think I'm your best friend? I'm the best of all your friends. Kind of person do you think I am? I start saying, oh, you just remember, John, as you're dying from that tumor, that I've always been your best friend, John. You owe a lot to me. Right? Okay. All right, And Jesus schools up. Did someone have a hand up that was walking?
Yeah, I have a lot of friends.
Ah,
You have a lot of friends.
no. My best friend is Jesus.
So, it's like,
Thanks a lot, Jesus.
Yeah, precious.
That's okay. That works for me. And then my family. But no, I don't have a lot of close friends.
That's it. You have any kids?
No. Don't have any children.
Are you serious?
I'm an unmarried man.
You didn't meet me.
Yeah, no, I'm an unmarried. I'm an unmarried man. So I have children.
Pretty big ones.
Anyways, here's what Jesus says about himself, He doesn't say that there isn't a greatest apostle. He doesn't say that there isn't a leader. He just says that the greatest of them should be as a servant and the leader should be as a servant. And then he says, I am amongst you as one who serves. It's not interesting. That's how Jesus describes himself, a slave or a servant, not as the master. But this is an interesting thing that Luke has from Q. And I confer a kingdom on you. So I give you a kingdom just as my Father God has given one to me. That you will eat and drink in my kingdom. You will have, remember this is the Last Supper, so it connects to a meal. You will have that ultimate meal with me in my kingdom, with me, where, well, okay, I guess Jesus isn't judging this way, but the apostles are. You will sit on thrones. Who sits on a throne? That person sits on a throne. Kings. How is that? But Mr. Gaffney, how does that work if Jesus is the King of Kings? He's the Messiah, King Messiah. How can you have like 12 other kings? You think so? You think so? Yeah, well, maybe, yeah, okay. You're going to sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So judging all the people of Israel, all the Jews. assuming that's the, I'm assuming he's not excluding Gentiles like me. I'm assuming it includes all the people of the world, but nevertheless, I don't know. It hasn't. I'm not there yet, so I don't know what the apostles' role might be. Maybe they will judge the Jew, but interesting. God is not a jealous God, I think. I always, when I read stuff like this. And Jesus is not jealous. It's not all about him, right? It's not like it's all mine. And you can have none of it. You can't cooperate with me, help me, join me, work with me. You can't, because I'm Jesus. And Jesus does it all. Well, okay, some Christians think that, we don't need priests to be in between us and Jesus. We don't need bishops between us and Jesus. I don't need a church to interpret the Bible for me, getting between me and Jesus. All right, fine. Some Christians are like that. But then the reason I'm not like that is because, I've read the New Testament. And that's not the Jesus I find. Jesus apparently is going to sit on a throne, but also the apostles are going to sit on thrones as well, as like kings, like him. Ooh, that's interesting. Jesus tells the apostles, I've done great works. You've seen me do great signs. You will do greater ones than I have done. Greater than Jesus? Is anything greater than Jesus? It's in the Gospel of John. You'll do greater signs than I have. Oh, wow. God's not an egotist in that way. He's not, egotistical. And at least not the God I know. I mean, God is God. He knows, God will show me very quickly where the boundary is, if I get too uppity. And I think it's all about me. But, and the same thing with the church. If you read the history of the church, when the church has started to think that it's all about herself and not about him. But he's not a jealous God in that sense, like it's all about me. You have no part in what I'm doing. No, he wants them to be part of it. He wants all of us to be part of it. He spreads it around. So the most important about, I already mentioned that. So the community life. So not necessarily living together, but, a church is a community. You come together. Well, can't you pray alone? Of course, you can talk to God wherever you want. All right? Obviously, God is everywhere. You don't have to be in a special building built a special way, blessed by a bishop in order to experience God or talk to him. Obviously, you can be out in nature, hiking around on a Sunday and still pray to God and worship God. All right, fine. But there's something about coming together, but no religion is individualistic. There's no religion of one, okay? And Christianity is no different. You're part of a community. We're together, okay? We're bound. Whether we like it or not, we're bound by our baptism, okay? And that means, you get together as a family at certain times for prayer. And Jesus apparently says that that's powerful. Jesus doesn't say, if you pray to God and ask for him what you want, you pray about something, God will do it for you. Jesus in the place in the gospel says, if 2 or 3, but at least 2 of you decide to pray for something in my name, God bless, God will do it for you. So already there, Jesus, at least the most basic community, the dyad of 2 people, that's the most basic community. It's not just a Christian living all on his lonesome. Not usually. You don't know about hermits, so no one can challenge me. Well, maybe Ms. Lacey. Go ahead. All right, I got to go after Mr. Hinkle. Mr. Hinkle might challenge me about hermits and say, well, what about that? Anyways, breaking of the bread, the ancient term for the celebration of the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. Yes, the Christians already in Acts, he doesn't tell us this here, Luke does not, but in Acts, for example, Acts 27, He tells us that already on Sundays, not on the Sabbath, not on the Jewish Sabbath, already the Christians have kind of made a switch or a change here. They might still go to synagogue on the Sabbath as Jews and still go to the temple, but on Sunday, which they now call the Lord's Day, the day when Jesus rose from the dead, they have their own special meal, which they call the breaking of the bread. And that makes no, you're fine. And that makes the church. For example, in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11, he says, when you meet as a church for the Lord's Supper, in verse 20. And he connects this coming together to celebrate the breaking of the bread, to offer up the bread and wine in memory of Jesus, and for other things to happen, which we'll talk about with the sacraments. But it makes the church. So the Eucharist makes the church. Your most truly church, the assembly of God, the Israel of God, when you come together to worship God through Christ in the offering of the Lord's Supper. That's very interesting because there are a lot of Christian churches that almost never do this. I mean, when I was doing my doctorate, I was living in the residence hall of the Presbyterian seminary, although I'm not Presbyterian, but the Presbyterians have come in and out of my life for a long, long time. I used to go to a Presbyterian youth group when I was in high school, and here I end up, living in the Presbyterian residence. But it was just the residence hall, You had people there who were in the medical school, the dental school, the nursing school. It was, mixed with everybody. I was the only theologian, in the whole group. But it was cool because I, got to become friends with, men and women who were studying to become ministers in church in Canada. Very nice. I remember one of my friends, he kind of liked the bling of religion. And, what is it called? Is it called the Book of Order, I think? But anyways, they have a book which has all the ceremonies, for worship services and stuff like that, baptisms. And even though they don't consider them official, like sacraments, they have stuff like, ordaining a minister, confirmation, and the Eucharist, of course, the Lord's Supper, and other things like that. And, but he's like, you can't get anyone to do these things. Like, we're allowed, you have to ask permission to celebrate the Lord's Supper because, believe it or not, the minister is not the one, Ms. O'Brien, who is in charge of the community. He's an employee. The session is what runs the community. The session is like a committee. Presbyterians are big on committees. They love committees. We call it the session. So you have the session, of which the minister might be a member, but it's filled with other members of the community. And they actually decide how many times per month, in some cases per year, they'll celebrate the Lord's Supper in the community. If you're lucky, usually from my estimation of about 4 times a year. Certainly like Christmas and Easter. Maybe a couple other times, because of the 4 seasons. If you were a liberal Presbyterian community, then you might have it every month. Well, if you want it every week, they direct you to Our Lady of the Holy Rosary down the street. That's what I call the R factor, the Roman factor. That's a little bit too far. The Eucharist is a good thing. The Lord's Supper, remembering Jesus and the bread and wine, stuff like that, beautiful. But, familiarity breeds contempt. You don't want to do it over and over again, because remembering the night when Jesus handed himself over, that's important, You want it to have impact, not becoming like part of regular daily life. Remembering every day, every week, over and over and over. I mean, how often can you talk about the death and resurrection of Christ? Really? We got the letters of Paul to preach on. I'm a bad, bad man. Anyways, the breaking of the bread. And the prayers. Notice that the apostles, Mr. Palumbo, were still acting like Jews. They didn't see that accepting Jesus as the Christ made them anything else. Jesus was the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. He was the King Messiah, as promised. Not exactly as expected, but as promised, Mr. Cummings. And so they're still going to the temple and praying. They're still acting like Jews. They had no awareness that proclaiming Jesus' messiahship or even his divine sonship, being the Son of God, no longer made them Jews because they didn't see Jesus as coming to destroy Judaism or its sacred institutions. Jesus never condemned the temple. He was angry when people were misusing it, right? He didn't take out a whip and whip the priests out of the temple. He whipped the businessmen out of the temple who were using it as a place of business for profane purposes, not a house of prayer. So, I mean, just didn't rail against the sacrifices of the temple. He told one of his lepers that he cleansed, go to the priest and offer the sacrifice that Moses prescribed. Didn't deny their scriptures or their rituals. He participated in them. So did the apostles. Now, we have to remember in this statement, I mean, this is it's historical in a sense that, there was a Christian community, but I wasn't there living. And most scholars think that this is probably Luke's idealized portrait of how the church should always be. Okay, that just seems to be how Luke presents things in Acts of the Apostles. He doesn't, because we know there were problems from Paul's letters. There were problems and divisions in early Christianity and questions and stuff like that. So it wasn't all, ha ha ha, kumbaya, gather us in the lost and person. Oh, dear Lord. It wasn't all that. Or the bane of my existence. Amazing grace. Which is not a bad hymn, but it's all the time. Huh? Yeah. Not on my watch, Ms. Lacey. Not on my watch. Let us build the kingdom of God. Lord. Catholic hymnography. Please bring us back to the Latin. Please. At least then I don't have to listen. I don't know what I'm saying, so I don't care. It's like, listen to this, Anyways, this is the ideal. This is what Luke thinks the church should be. Centered around the teaching of the apostles, community life, the Eucharist, and prayer. Okay, so this is what the church should be. Was it actually like that, or is it always actually like that? No, not necessarily. But these are for him the essential elements of what the church is. Okay? And it's a typology. Any of you are taking like sociology or something like that for social work or psychology or something, you come across, what's his name, Max Weber, typologies, they're just like lists of things that you want included to when something, it's like when you're talking about, marriage before being married, what kind of, woman am I looking for? Well, she has to be this, she has to be that, or just be that. That's a typology. You're going through the things that you want in your perfect type of a mate, whatever that is, personality or what they look like, whatever. And that's all it is. It's a typology. It's a list of what you want to find. So these are the essential things that Luke wants to find in the church. Okay, and this is the ideal that the church is supposed to be living up to. Doesn't always happen. As anyone who's been to a Catholic church knows, is. I'm going to talk about Paul. I think I'll skip over Paul. I love you, Paul, but, Paul of Tarsus I've mentioned already. But, maybe if I have to come back to him, I will. I'll skip to the apostles. The apostles is the earthly foundation of the church. Yes, Jesus describes himself as the cornerstone. of the church, of the building. But, I'm not a GA, I'm not or a GC, a general contractor, right? I've never built a building in my life. I wouldn't know. But I've watched the contracting shows and the renovation shows and see how, one of my friends, I do have one friend, but he doesn't live around here. He's up in Canada that I went to school with. He lived also in the residence with me. He was doing architecture. And yeah, he would know how to build. I wouldn't know where to begin. Okay. But apparently when you're building a building, at least in the ancient world, you start out with a capstone or a cornerstone from which you then build off of and measure off of, the rest of the walls, to make sure they're straight. Okay. And then as you go up again, to make sure they're straight and level. Okay. Stuff like that. All right. But the capstone is very important. So even here at Gwynedd Mercy, like they're building, right? Building. Are they still building new buildings? I forget. Are we still building new buildings? Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm just wondering, because I keep getting these construction emails, and I'm not sure what's being constructed.
They're redoing the doors.
Huh?
They're doing one of those doors.
Oh, okay, they're redoing it, but they're not building, okay. But they have built new buildings on campus, right? Yeah. Yeah. HIC, what is that? Out there? Yeah. All right. So I'm sure when they built it and they laid first stone, they had a little celebration, right? People go out there in their hard hats and shovel and they take pictures. And it's the first thing that's going down in the building. Even if it's not a stone, if it's like a huge building, they put down piles, which are like big columns. But it's not necessarily like the old days with a huge cornerstone. But you see this. You might see, you see this like if you go over to whatchamacallit, the St. Bernard's, I forget, St. Mary's. What is that? St. Catherine's over there? St. Catherine's Hall, right? No, we're in St. Bernard. We're over there where the registrar is. That's St. Catherine's. Campbell. All right, thank you. You see there's a cornerstone there. The building was built in 1968. Seen that? Walking by? Yeah, there's a cornerstone. But Ms. Sorry. But Ms. O'Brien, there are other stones that built, right?
I feel like one day you're gonna give me a heart attack.
No, you're too young to have a heart attack, Ms. Franco Zamora here. I'm trying to keep people's attention. But I can't because I'm going to annoy my colleagues. So I got to remember not to do that. Anyways, so Jesus is the capstone, the cornerstone, and then there are other foundation stones built off of him. That's the image that's used in the scriptures. The apostles were viewed as special conduits of Christ's authority. Jesus wasn't with the church anymore. He's always with the church, but not physically, right? But he was with the church through the 12 men or the people who followed around with him and saw him risen from the dead, Ms. Hoy. Yes. So they're part of the church's foundation. How do I know this? Again, I'm your worst nightmare. I'm a Catholic who's read the Bible. Or why do I think this, I should say? Because I could be wrong. But the book of Revelation. Let's go to the Apocalypse of John. One of the last books to have been written in the New Testament. Scholars believe chapter 21. Chapter 21. Starting with verse 9. Let me know when you have it, Miss Farley. Go ahead, Miss Farley.
Said to me, "Come here, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb."
Spirit to the great high mountain, shows you the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. It gleamed with the splendor of God, its radiance was like that of a precious stone, like jasper, clear as crystal. Massive high wall with 12 gates where 12 angels were stationed, and on which names were inscribed, names of the 12 tribes of the Israelites. There were 3 gates facing east, 3 north, 3 south.
Keep going.
And 3 west. The wall of the city had 12 courses of stones as its foundation, on which were inscribed the 12 names of the 12 apostles. The one who stood to be.
Oh, that's fine. That's okay. Good. Excellent. Okay, so again, it's a book of visions, like most apocalyptic literature, visions of heaven, visions of the future, stuff like that. And this is a vision of after God has triumphed over evil, the devil and the beast and such like that. This guy, John, whoever he is taken up and he has a vision of a new heaven being created and a new earth. And he's through these visions, he's kind of led by an angel who explains things to him. It's also a staple of apocalyptic literature. Usually the person who's taken up in the vision, encounters like some supernatural being, like an angel or something, who then explains what the visions mean. Okay, so 7 angels, one of the 7 angels said, "Come here, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb, which is the city of the New Jerusalem, coming down from heaven, from God." So God is sending it down. What is this city? It seems to be a metaphor for the church, again, the Christian community. Why do I know or think this? Because, the Lamb, which is an image of Jesus, the city has no temple. The Lamb becomes its temple. Okay? People are worshiping the Lamb who was killed in the city. They're not going to a temple anymore and sacrificing animals. Okay? There's one who was sacrificed, Jesus. So it seems to be a metaphor or an image being used for the church. And it's interesting with what language this guy John describes the church. She is the wife of Jesus. She is his bride.
I was confused. What was the meaning of, I know she was the wife, but the lamb is not a girl.
Oh yeah, well, the lamb is one of those things that would be sacrificed during Passover in the temple.
Oh,
Okay, it was the Passover sacrifice. And yeah, it could be a goat or a lamb, but that's since Jesus is now seen as that lamb in a metaphorical sense who sacrificed himself by dying on the cross, shedding his blood during Passover time. Okay. And Jesus so that's where the symbol comes from, of Jesus being called a lamb.
thank you.
Going.
It's going.
Just do that because, I don't know, you seem to freak out when I say hello. It's like, hello. Anyways. And there's a description of this city, okay? It's brilliant. It gleams with the splendor of God. It has precious stones, different precious stones as part of it. It has a massive high wall with 12 gates, with 12 angels guarding the gates, an angel for each gate. But notice what's on the gates. On the gates are the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. So the names of the 12 sons of Israel, from which the family groups came from. Reuben, Dan, Gad, Issachar, Benjamin, Judah, etc., and so forth. Okay? Their names are written. As I told you also at the beginning of this, when I started talking about Jesus' ministry and stuff like that, you can't underestimate the Jews either. Because even in the coming of the new heavens and the new earth, the wall of the new Jerusalem will have their names written on them. They're still important. The Jews are still important to God. This is for them that God is doing these things. And I, as a Gentile, am kind of like the dog at the table who wants the piece of rib or something. I'm able to eat scrap that falls from the children's table. Sound familiar? Eating the scrap. But then I get to my, okay, so I move on. There were 3 gates facing east, north, south, and west. So you have gates in each of the walls, and then you have a foundation. The wall of the city had 12 courses of stone as its foundation. So it seems like it had 12, what he means is it had 12 layers of foundation, one set on top of the other. And on each of these levels was written the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Interesting. Why isn't the Lamb the cornerstone of the New Jerusalem, of the wall? Probably, I would imagine, because he doesn't have to be. The Lamb is the center of the New Jerusalem. He's the temple. He's the place of worship now. But the whole foundation of this New Jerusalem in which the Lamb resides, and apparently all his followers, those who worship the Lamb who was killed, is built on these 12 men. They're the 12 foundations. I'm assuming, because their names are written on them, on all the stones. Now, that's all well and good. A question we have to ask is, okay, so the apostles are important to the church. But how do we get from the apostles to today? I mean, the apostles were just men. They weren't gods, okay? And they, as men, went the way of all human beings. They died eventually. They're not around anymore. When there's the general resurrection, they'll come back, but they're in heaven with Christ, I believe. But they're not physically here with us. So how do we make the connection between them and now? Well, again, people, they passed it on. They just passed it on. For that matter, how do you make the connection with Jesus? Jesus passed on his authority to the 12, to other people. He didn't keep it all to himself. So it doesn't die with him or go away with him when he ascends into heaven. And the same thing with the apostles. It doesn't die with them. The authority continues, because that would seem to be the logical outlook, I would think, or outcome. Jesus wanted it to continue. He wanted his community to grow over time. And see you next week. Bless you all. Have a good day, Mrs. Oh, come on. I got you. Have a good day, miss. Have a good day, miss. Thank you. Hello, sir.